Welcome to Wilde Discourse. I am Tim Wilde, and I'm here on a very special episode of my channel to discuss a very kind of heavy, a little bit slightly very controversial topic. I have two guests that I'm going to be bringing on to discuss this with me. And before I do, I wanted to make a couple of thoughts. I usually do this in post-production after we do the interview or the recording. I'll go in and add some thoughts leading into the discussion. Then I'll have some follow-up comments and feedback and testimony. I always share my testimony at the end of these videos. And in this situation, I actually wanted to do it up front. I wanted to share some thoughts, not thoughts. I don't want to get them in the waiting room, getting too concerned that they're going to be here a long time. I just wanted to just share my very quick feelings about the men that we're going to be discussing and the testimony I have about the church and the organization of the church, the quorum of the 12 apostles, and the quorum of the first presidency. Is that a quorum? It's not really a quorum. It's a presidency. That they lead and guide the church, and those quorums and presidencies have been looked over in various ways or levels by the Lord since the organization of the church by Joseph Smith. I just wanted to say I love these men. I don't study as much as I should their teachings. I have, and I reference these often, the teachings of the prophets and the presidents of the church in our day, including and especially Brigham Young. We're going to be talking a little bit about him and the history of the racial issues of the withholding, the policy in the church of holding the priesthood from them and those privileges and opportunities in the temple through a long period of time that we're going to talk about by the church until that policy was changed in the 70s, 78 by President Kimball. A lot of controversy, a lot of disagreement among those men and how that revelation came into fruition, why that policy was there for such a long time, and maybe what their motivations were that are maybe offensive to us or concerning or alarming. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But I just wanted to say before we start, to kind of set the tone about how I feel, instead of doing this in post-production later on, that I absolutely know that these were men of God. Imperfect, yes, with many issues. And they confess their own struggles, their own problems, their own weaknesses, even Brigham Young. And if you read his book, I lost it now. If you read his book, he'll talk about his own weaknesses in there, talking about temperament and impatience and things like that. As he's counseling the brethren, he will confess in that spirit that he is a man that's struggling with weaknesses just like anybody else. But he was a visionary man. He was a man of God, and he was a man of his time that we're going to talk about. But I just wanted it clear right up front that the prophet that I grew up admiring and respecting was President Hinckley. And I know Gordon B. Hinckley, he absolutely reverenced Brigham Young. And he had his painting. I remember hearing him in talks talk about looking at the painting of Brigham Young and having inspiration when he was in very trying times and struggling with a heavy complication or something going on in the church. And he would look at that painting and say, Brigham, you had faith. And I have faith in President Hinckley, and President Hinckley had faith in Brigham Young. I know Brigham Young was a man of God. He was called by Joseph Smith. They were very close friends. And I know Joseph Smith was a prophet. The same way that I felt as a missionary teaching about Joseph Smith and feeling the Spirit confirmed to my soul, my heart, that he was a man of God and that the first vision actually happened, is exactly how I felt whenever I heard President Hinckley teach. And that's the same way I feel when I read the words of President Young. But they had a lot of things that they said, maybe off book, out of context, or not as an official prophet. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. That would be concerning and legitimately concerning. But I just wanted it clear that I have a testimony that these men are prophets. They led the church righteously as best as they knew how, and with their own weaknesses, the Lord was in control the entire time. I know that, and I know they were good men, and they loved their brothers and sisters, and they did what they could in their time to prepare the church in its strength for us today, led by President Nelson, who is also a prophet of God. And I testify of that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Now, I'm bringing on two of my closest friends, and closeness is a description of proximity, not quality. that they're the people in my life who know me the best, and I spend the most time interacting with in all my struggles and weaknesses, and they're friends from many other channels. I put off having them on this new channel for a while, but it was inevitable that we were going to have Lance Carlile and Josh Edlow come on. I'm going to bring on Lance real quick. Hello, Lance.
Hi, I'm here to represent all the Black people and the women.
Yes. Now, Lance is here because Lance has a different approach to talking about things. Sometimes he's not as tactful as you can. If you follow him on Facebook, anyone that watches this, you know that he can be very blunt, very direct, but he's a very faithful man. I just want to say before I bring Josh on, I have made personal threats to both of them. Lance studies martial arts. He's more aggressive, and he's more probably wirely than I am. Wirely. And Lance could probably, physically take me, but and Josh
Probably.
is like 6'8", whatever. He's a bodybuilder, a trained professional wrestler. He's been paid for it, so yes, professional. But I've made physical threats to both of them. If they ever fell away from the church, I would be irate because these are my closest brethren in my faith in the church. They're not why I have a testimony, but they're two of the people I lean on the most when times come up in my life where I need a boost of faith or someone to just talk things out with, which is the point of this conversation. Josh Edlow had a discussion with Dr. Matt Harris, Ph.D. Well, that's why I said doctor, who had a conversation with him about the history of Blacks in the priesthood and how the revelation came by President Kimball to withdraw it, take it back, whatever, change that policy. And it was a very good conversation. And before I bring Josh on, I just wanted to say, Lance, I appreciate you coming on because I know I'm glad Josh is doing his podcast, but I don't post all of his videos. I don't watch all of his videos, but this one was very interesting to me. And he told me about it ahead of time. And I shared it with Lance, and both of us posted it separately, sharing it on Facebook. So Josh, you should be grateful for that because we don't promote your stuff. And I know Lance doesn't watch my stuff. But Lance, I just want, before I bring Josh on, what was it that interests you in this topic, that you watched it and that you were excited about it? And we're not going to go through and break down the whole episode, but we just want to talk about why we were having this follow-up discussion about it. But Lance, what did you like about the episode that got you interested in share, that you even shared it? In the subject.
I mean, to me, the biggest thing is the topic of revelation, and that's a huge topic now. Like, I think it's bigger. That topic has been bigger on the minds of the prophet and recent, church talks and leaders than it ever has been in my lifetime, at least.
Yeah.
And
we never thought about it as kids. It was just the prophet spoke, and that's the doctor that's just coming out of their mouth.
And then there's this intersection between, it's the information age. There's this intersection between church culture expanding out into different countries and different cultures, and that it's no longer a Utah church.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons you don't have a Black guy on this podcast, Tim, is because we literally grew up in a community. Like, I can only remember seeing one Black guy when I grew up in our town, and he got, their family left because, I don't know, they weren't treated well, or I mean, can you imagine being the only Black people?
Yeah.
And so
in Utah in the 80s and 90s, yeah.
And so that's Utah, and now it's changed. Like, it literally has changed. There's more members outside of the church, and I get to be a part of that because I work for the church, and I get to see all these policy changes, all these like cultural changes, and it's just this huge whirlwind of that mixed with revelation
process and application changes, right?
Mixed with exposure, good and bad, that the church received.
That PR is a real thing. Yeah. For the church, yeah. When you say that, after the George Floyd, everything, all the riots and everything going on with that, and all the Black Lives Matter stuff was being pitched, and that was the big thing, was for all it was an outreaching for Black people. And I remember, and I said this on Saints on Cinema, which I do with Josh as well. I don't remember where it came up, but I was like, I wish I had a black friend. I want to like embrace and talk about it and celebrate it. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. I'm an idiot. Like my next door neighbor is a friend of mine. He's like black. He's a super cool guy. And we've had great conversations. He's not a member of the church. And I just want to say publicly that I was stated by him in front of my children and my ex-wife that I'm not racist. He said so.
That settles
Anyway,
it. Well,
yeah.
I'm not racist. I've been told I'm not racist because I'm married to a Chinese woman. So
there you go. Yeah.
apparently that means I'm automatically not racist.
Yeah, you're open. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. But Lance, I appreciate you being on here. Just kind of help balance out in case, not balance out, you're mediating or anything. It's just like if I can't think of, I stumble my words sometimes. I appreciate just having another person for this discussion because you have a good point of view as well. And I did want to talk about how you feel about some of those things like interracial marriage and stuff like that. But let's get Josh on here. Josh, before we start, I don't do this normally because I don't care about you that much, but I want to thank you. And I did this before privately, but publicly, I want to thank you for putting that episode together. I really appreciate that you did some research. You found Brother Harris. I'm gonna call him brother. He's a doctor, whatever. He spiritually though, I loved how he represented the church, his mannerisms, his tone, his approach, the things he said, and the stipulations he put on you and having the interview in the first place. Very appropriate, very humble, very direct, and is not just a mindless person just following the gospel. But you researched him, you talked to him, you did a lot of prep work, you started into his books, and you have another discussion that's going to be planned about some political stuff we don't need to get into now, and I'm excited about that one as well. I know Lance was too. But seriously, as your friend, I appreciate that you brought, and it's not you're the only podcast he's ever done, and he wrote the books. We're going to talk about it, but I appreciate the way that you brought him in and brought I guess this history to my life. And I'm going to let you, not my life. Well, I guess my life. I wasn't trying to be that, weird about it, but I'm just meaning to the public, to my view, I guess. But I wanted to thank you for that. Seriously, it was a very well done interview, mostly because you didn't talk very much, not like me on my show. But it was awesome. And I just want to, before we go any further, I'll let Josh introduce what his podcast is, the Edlow Podcast, because we haven't done any discussions on my channel yet, in case there's anyone who watches this isn't aware. But you brought on Dr. Matthew L. Harris, and I'll let you go ahead and welcome or introduce yourself, Josh, and just kind of what was it that, how did you find, just really quickly, how did you find him, and what made this just a topic that you wanted to discuss on your podcast that I appreciated so much, and Lance did?
Yeah, so there was like 6 or 7 questions over the course of that.
And also, what's your favorite color?
I'll try to address them. I'll try to address them all. So, the Edlow Podcast is really interesting human interest podcast, and what I mean by that is I'm the human that's interested. So I just put people on who I find interesting and try to figure out what makes them tick. And really, the purpose is to show a human element to everybody, because we live in an age where everyone's yelling at each other, and there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of things people assume about other people. So I have a lot of different topics and a lot of different cool things that I talk about. And, it is not a Mormon podcast, although we do that is not my podcast. That's when I spoke.
I was like, what is this?
Yeah, that's when I spoke about being an attorney on another podcast. There's my podcast.
This one?
Yeah, the Edlow Podcast. And yeah, I mean, I have had all sorts of different people on there. But I do tend to have people on, there are some stories of different types of members of the church. Matthew Harris, actually, it was interesting because I had a previous scholar who I had known through my mission, Patrick Mason, who's he's probably the leading scholar on any sort of issue when it comes to our faith. I mean, anytime something controversial comes on, the Associated Press calls him for comment. And so we did a podcast on faith crisis, And then I can't remember if he specifically suggested Matthew, or if I think I stumbled upon Dr. Harris. He had been quoted in an article I was reading on the church, and they had mentioned that he had written a couple of different books. And so I sent a message to Patrick and just said, "Hey, Patrick, what do you think of this guy?" And he said, "There's nobody better to talk to about race in the church in the 20th century." And so I
said leading scholar in the world, right? Is that what he said?
Yeah, he told me, he said, there is nobody in the world that's better and then more knowledgeable on the topic of race in the 20th century specifically than Matthew Harris. So I found his website or his email because he's a professor, and I just emailed him and I said, "Hey, would you be interested in coming on a podcast?" He's like, "Yeah, I do a bunch of them." And we had conversations from there, a bunch of emails back and forth. And then we probably spent about a half hour before I hit record just talking about what I wanted to do. And the other thing I would say about this podcast in particular,
you're talking about your interview with him, or this?
Yeah, this topic in particular, and really, I would say there have been a few of them like this, where I felt a great responsibility, which sounds a little silly because, it's just a podcast that I'm doing, kind of like a vanity project, right?
Casual. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have followers, I have subscribers, and it grows every time I do another podcast, and I'm getting better at it. But it's really just if nothing ever comes of it, I don't care. It's just I find it interesting. And so, but for some reason,
there's a little bit of weight and a responsibility when you're talking about something this big, because no matter what you do, as a regular member of the church, which you don't hide from on your show, even though that's not the big emphasis necessarily, in conversations like this, you own it. And as a member of the church who are out there having an open dialogue publicly on social media and YouTube, which is social media, you do have a little bit of responsibility. And this is a huge topic. And that's why I love the tact. I love the approach, and I love the tone of the whole conversation. And I love when you kind of not that you push back or you stop once in a while in your interview. And I have a couple of responses to what some questions you had that you stop and say, "Hang on, let's pull back just for a second," for people watching this who might feel that this is the tone, but this isn't really what the tone is, that this is like attacking the church or over criticizing or whatever. And I appreciated that perspective, that as you were hosting it, you were able to slow down and kind of put that in perspective for the audience. Yeah. So, but there is ownership. It is a real thing. We took this a little seriously too.
Well, yeah. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is I do tend to speak to a lot of people in my circle who, for whatever reason, are struggling with faith. And so, and I know that this is a topic that is an uncomfortable topic, right? I mean, it is kind of a scar in Mormon history, I would say. And I think everyone would agree that this is something that over the course of time has developed into, people are realizing more and more that this is a big problem, and it's a big problem for a lot of people. And I think even Dr. Harris would agree with me. In fact, I know he does. He said it on the podcast that the church has not done a great job of owning this history.
And telling the history too.
Yeah, in telling the story, there's a little bit of what therapists call gaslighting going on, where they're pretending as though something different happened, and that's a problem. And it doesn't. And I should say here right off the gate, and I spoke about it at the beginning of the podcast with him, was he had a couple of rules that he gave me at the beginning. He said, my 2 rules are: 1, I don't ever want to talk about particularly my faith. And the other rule was I don't want to be particularly antagonistic about the church. I want it to stay respectful, and I want the discussion to focus on my scholarship.
Yeah.
And so, and I appreciated that. And it really did. And, it was really a very fact evidence-based discussion based on, and I would tell you that in talking with, I've probably spent now an hour off record with Matthew Harris. He's very accessible as far as questions. And awesome. and he's very open.
So
Well,
He's-
I think Josh, that you should get credit too, in that even though he said that, I think you didn't pull any punches in some of your questions that you asked. And I thought they were really good questions. Like, I don't know if you have any kind of background in journalism or that kind of thing, but you asked.
Saints on Cinema for
Yeah.
40 years.
No, but in all seriousness, like, in my opinion, you asked some really great questions and I think you pulled him out of some of his comfort zone a little bit too, and not too pushy of a way. And it was, I don't like podcasts because they're too long. I watched all 4 hours. How long was it? It was long, but
Like 2.5, 3 hours.
and I enjoyed it. Like it,
Yeah.
and it was too short for me. So like I think
Yeah.
it was really good.
Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, I should suggest, and I say this because if somebody hears this, actually, it was really funny. Some of the responses I've gotten to some of these podcasts about this. My approach to the podcast when I have a guest on, whether it's someone who's talking about scholarship or someone telling a story, is that I really want to get the human behind it. And so I don't try really, really hard. I try really hard not to put my finger on the story. I really want to hear it from their perspective, but I will push back. And I tell all of my guests beforehand, I don't give them any outlines. I don't give them the questions beforehand. And I tell them that's by design. And I don't really have an outline. I mean, I have a general sense in my head where I want it to go. But I also tell them, I said, I'm going to just letting you know, I'm not going to pull punches and I'm not going to, I'm not going to shy away from hard questions. And I think he appreciated that. And,
you could tell from his when you brought it up in the channel that that his stipulations and coming on, what your goal was. Like, you could tell he appreciated your approach as well.
Yeah,
you appreciated it. Yeah.
And so anyway, I guess my point is that I try very hard to let the guest share their story, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
Pushing back at places where I know that listeners are going to have questions. So I very often will say, there's probably somebody listening to this podcast who is thinking to themselves. Like, one of the things that I thought was very important to bring up during this podcast was that, yes, there were things that do not make the church, it does not portray the church in a great light, right? I mean, and that's just because of it's an uncomfortable topic. I mean, it just is. And so there are things that people are going to hear, and I know the tendencies of kind of traditionalist Mormon members, and there's kind of a, I know this is overgeneralization, but I mean, like, there tends to be a natural tendency to think that anything that portrays the church in a bad light you must be antagonistic to the church, or you must be like, it's anti-Mormon, and it really
taboo.
is.
It's a sacred cow, right?
Right. So for example, like, at one point I stopped and I said, "No, Dr. Harris, there's someone who's listening to this, probably thinking that we're kind of bashing the church. Like, what would you say to that person?" And he was very cordial and very articulate in his responses to those types of questions. So I think I
think that in general, like you mentioned, the weight of responsibility. I think, and this is why Tim is actually, like, he should get some praise for his podcast too. Is that the social media and just this is all a new animal to the church and members of the church, and they're still struggling with getting into the technology. Like, how do you portray your religion? When do you talk about religion? When do you not? And I'm just talking about general membership, not even the church and their PR department.
Yeah.
And so the responsibility is, like, in some ways, pioneering this. Like, how do you talk about the church in social media?
It's a valid point, and I remember within the last 10 years, I can't remember when it was it happened several times since then. The first time in general conference when an apostle, I think it was Bednar, was the first one I remember hearing say it, or mention social media and Facebook posts and stuff, and using that as a way of expressing and sharing the gospel, or sharing your testimony, or standing up for your beliefs. And like, I mean, within your comfort zone. I couldn't believe he said it. I was like, wow, it's like hearing, it was like almost like bringing this worldly thing into like the spiritual thing. I was like, I've never thought these worlds would collide.
Well, and right now you frequently hear them still collide, where like you'll hear one talk where they're like, take, I'm speaking generally, but like, take all cell phones away from your children, it's destroying them. And then in the next talk, it's like, open up your cell phone to the scriptures, open up the church's app. Like, there's still a conflict there that like is working its way out.
And I think that is a very small example of what you hear this topic in the podcast, right? Is that there are diverse opinions within the church on how to handle these things, and that includes how to handle this issue of Black people somewhere along the way having the priesthood withheld from them, and how they navigate that as the years go on.
Josh, right there before you go on, I'll let you go ahead and introduce what the discussion was for anyone that's listened this far doesn't really have an idea what we're talking about. Go ahead, Josh, and explain what the conversation was about. And it was about Blacks in the priesthood, I mean, overall, but there was a lot of other undertone things like institutional revelation stuff we're going to talk about. But just go ahead and explain for anyone that didn't watch your interview that we're sitting here praising, and we kind of want to move on, what it was. And you go ahead and explain who he was and what your discussion was about.
Sure.
I'll pull this up while you talk.
Oh, there you go. Okay, you have the book there. So this is the book that Dr. Harris co-wrote with Newell Bringhurst. It's called The Mormon Church and Blacks, A Documentary History. And this book is not a normal read where it's just Dr. Harris writing his opinions. The way that this book is written is each chapter has something to do with this topic, and then they go number by number on certain things about where the doctrine comes from, where the source material is, and then it goes to a document introduction, the document itself, and then a commentary on each topic. And so each chapter is different parts of the topic, and then he came on and he discussed the history of the withholding of temple of priesthood and temple covenants from Black people, and then its restoration and the aftermath. So we really went through from the very beginning the history of this topic and where it came from. And I learned a ton of things that I just never knew.
Yeah.
And things that like you're just not going to get taught in a gospel doctrine class.
No. Information and details. Who was talking to who had conversations with who was living or serving where, in which years, just different private conversations happened that only he had access to, like in their journals. And I could not believe the detail and the chronology of this history. It was so fascinating. And hearing about the players, sorry to interrupt you. It was so cool though. That's what I loved about it.
Yeah. I described it. I said it's like listening to what's his name? He just passed away. James McCullough, reading his book on like Ben Franklin or John Adams. You know what I mean?
1776 guy. I didn't know he died.
Yeah, he passed away. And he's the one who wrote John Adams. I don't know if he wrote all the other ones, but anyway, the point is that it was that in depth, right? I mean, and Dr. Harris, just so everybody knows, he uses documents for his books that are previously not available. And he has access to the church archives. And then on top of that, also, he has worked with all the families. So he's been able to get like the personal journals of,
President Kimball and
P. Brown, President Kimball, Harold B. Lee, different players in this, and documents that people wrote and histories, and actually went and talked to other people. Like there's a story about in the 90s, there was an African-American member of the church who wrote several letters to the church asking if after the ban, the church still believed that the Black skin was a curse.
Yeah.
And he actually sought the guy out.
Yeah.
And actually, interviewed him. I mean, that's this type of stuff that he did. I mean, his research was incredibly extensive on this topic.
So as we continue on talking about the points that were brought up in the podcast, all credit goes to Dr. Harris. I mean, it's a fascinating buy the book. I'll bring it up one more time. I mean, if you have interest in it, our conversation is going to be bouncing off of things that were discussed on Josh's episode, and I'll have links for that, obviously. But the actual information, that information is by Brother Harris. Go to get the book. I guess Josh, he has another book coming out soon.
Yeah, I don't know.
He talks about that on your channel.
Yeah, and he said that it goes through a pretty extensive. These books have to go through a pretty extensive peer review process before they're released. They're all released by the Utah State Press, I think is what it is. University of Illinois Press. So these are, and that's the other thing I think is important, because I've some of the pushback I've gotten on social media is from people who, I put on little 1-minute clips, and I'll put them on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and some people will hear the 1-minute clip and then they'll just be like, oh, well, of course, BYU this, BYU that. So I want to make it clear, like, Dr. Harris had an undergrad degree from BYU. He got his Ph.D. from Syracuse. Okay. He is not employed by the church. He does not teach at BYU. His books are not found in Deseret Book.
Yeah.
I mean, his books are outside the realm of the church, as are Patrick Mason's. So these guys are not, they're
even if he was, he was a church employee, even if he did get all his education from BYU, like this, I think that we have this issue with a lot of people online is like, show me what he said that wasn't factual. Like, he was very factual. He was very scholarly in everything he stated. So it's hard to say, well, he was biased, because, what
his tone was not biased.
No. And that's what I think was so important about this, is that, like, it's an issue, you wanted to talk, and maybe I'm going out of turn on this.
You're fine.
But you wanted to talk about the you said offline that you wanted to talk about the backlash. And
that's great. Yeah, I want to hear about it, because I was part of that backlash with you privately.
Yeah, I wouldn't even characterize it as a backlash, as a diverse reaction to the podcast. This is probably maybe not. It's definitely I've done 26 interviews now, and this is top 3 in wide-ranging reaction, because I feel like it's the type of stuff where if you're there's people who find things in it that are faith promoting. There's people who find it as doubtful. I think the people who are searching for faith promoting stuff find it. People who are looking for things to cast doubt will find it. And then I think there's a wide range in between, where people learn some things that they didn't expect. But yeah, it's actually been probably the most fascinating and also troubling thing about podcasting in all of them.
And this is what I named. The name of the episode is "The Wake of the Edlow Podcast Discussion," not the backlash or the aftermath or anything, because I wasn't even involved, but it was the wake of it. And I want to hear some of the experience. Go ahead.
Being a little vulnerable, it actually kind of bothers me, because, like, when
the history or the podcast,
the reaction. Because what bothers me, I think, and this is just, maybe it's silly, maybe I take too much of this too seriously, but, like, the purpose of my podcast is to get people to hear things from a different perspective and understand where someone else might be coming from. So, like, for example, right, I want people who are faithful members of the church to understand that if someone is hurt by this, right, is hurt by this history, particularly a Black member of the church or somebody who's very, very interested in race, who realizes that people have very much been hurt by this doctrine, and that is a reason for them to have struggles with the church, they need to understand that that is very real.
Yeah.
And it's not some excuse so they can go out and party or do something else. It's not about a lack of faith. Maybe it is, but it's a legitimate struggle.
And a
also,
variety of things with different people.
right. And also, I want people who are doubtful, who just antagonistic to the church, to understand that there are members of the church who are troubled by this, that we're not just ignoring it and we're just a bunch of racists, right? Like,
I think too that you know, one thing that I think actually drives people away from the church or stops them from, you know, exploring and learning more about the church is this fake facade that is also often put on it of perfection, right? Or again, like the taboo sacred cow attitude. And there's a lot of members of the church, like if you say one single thing, whether true or not, about maybe something the church did wrong, or like the blacks in the priesthood, then to them it's like, oh, you're attacking the church, you're faithless, you're it reminds me a lot of in the Book of Mormon when Abinadi starts criticizing the church of his time, and they're like, why don't you just, doesn't Isaiah say how beautiful on the tops of the mountains, and it is like, you guys are sinning and you have serious problems, and you have no idea what those scriptures mean anyway. So so anyway, it breaks that facade, and that's hard for some people to stomach.
Just one other fast example. As I've been teaching my Book of Mormon Institute class, last week we were in Second Nephi, where Nephi was talking about, the plainness. We talk of Christ, we preach of Christ, we rejoice in Christ. That chapter, and he talks about how he loves talking about the gospel. He loves talking about Jesus. He loves that's the emphasis of his record. But he's like, but my people, they didn't live in Jerusalem. They weren't there at my time. And I'm sorry, but the ways of the Jews, his people, Nephi was a Jew. I mean, in the house, but he was like, they were wicked. They were bad. And these were the covenant people of the Lord, waiting for the Messiah to come through that heritage. But he's like, I didn't even bother teaching my people about them much other than context for some Isaiah chapters, because Isaiah talked about his time and the coming of Christ and the last days. So he taught that to his people, but he's like, I didn't even bother teaching them about, the 1800s and racism and all that stuff, because we're talking about moving forward. I'm trying to focus on the gospel, Jesus Christ, the important things. But Josh, you said earlier, you used the word scar. I think that's a great description, because you could say that the wound has healed over from the policy being changed in 78, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a memory of the pain, and that doesn't mean things don't ache and itch and still have reminiscing medical issues from it. The wound has been healed, it's been fixed, where everyone can move on, everything's functional, but it doesn't just erase and change everything. But there's also something to be said, we'll get into it a little bit, about moving forward. And that's when you talk about President Hinckley that concept.
Let me push back a little bit on that.
Go for it.
Your analogy is a little off in that, maybe we've stopped the bleeding, but I don't think the wound is fully scarred over. And the reason for that is because,
there's still people,
Well, no, I think that the priesthood ban was, and we can talk about the chronology here in a minute, but like the priesthood ban was lifted in 1978, but there was no real kind of acknowledgement that all of the doctrine behind it, the black people were cursed because of Cain, or that they were less valiant in the pre-existence. None of that was even closely repudiated until 2013.
Which the essay, and you're saying, I'm sorry for interrupting. I'm just saying that pain for those people and the offense that they're still being taught those things, they're hearing those things in church, is still real, and the wound is still.
Well, and I also want to say that, like, Dr. Harris did a good job of explaining this, right? He said, when I read the gospel essay, I said, oh, good, they're finally repudiating it. But then his other Ph.D. friend, or his brother, or whoever it was, said, where did you read that? And I had to explain it to him.
You had to walk them through the essay, how they apologize.
Yeah, and he's like, I shouldn't have to explain it, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing, right? I bet, like, that was if I'm being completely honest, that was the first time that I'd heard the churches even repudiated that, was when I started reading his book. I didn't even know they had, right? So it's now official, and a lot of members don't know this, it's now official that the church has come out and said that those doctrines are not doctrines and never were doctrines, right?
Can I go ahead?
But hold on, let me finish that.
Yeah.
What that means is there's probably a gospel doctrine teacher somewhere still teaching that.
There absolutely is. I guarantee it.
In fact, part of the thing that's so funny about that is that gospel essay came out, Dr. Harris believes, in response to a journalist going to BYU and a BYU professor basically telling this journalist that was the doctrine of the church.
Yeah, and when you say there's probably some gospel doctrine somewhere, most people's minds are like, yeah, in some foreign country, in some strange branch that doesn't have a lot of. No, we're talking about like our wards in Utah.
Yeah, right now. Yeah,
I'm sure. Yeah, and the thing is that, like, that, I mean, when you hear the stories that Dr. Harris was talking about of, like, Black kids coming up to apostles in Brazil and saying, "Oh, I hate my blackness," and things of that nature, that are part of the story of what changed the hearts of some of these apostles who were more traditionalists.
Well, imagine being a Black person and reading the passages in the Book of Mormon in which, the Nephites were racist. I love the one where he's like, well, we know that if we give wine to a Lamanite, that it will do the same thing to the Nephite, even in a certain way. That is a form of racism. That's institutional racism, right? And they struggle with it. And imagine being a Black person and reading that every time you sit down to read the book.
By some white missionaries from America trying to teach you the gospel so that we can baptize you and you can't get all the full benefits. But I want to share this with you. I found this on accident. This was a speech by Bruce R. McConkie after the change. This is called "Alike Unto God." This didn't come up, not that it had to in your discussion, but I found it very interesting. Part of it says, and I have a hard time reading on camera, I apologize. We have read these passages and their associated passages for many years. We have seen what the words say, and we have said to ourselves, yes, it says that, but we must read out of it the taking of the gospel and the blessings of the benefit to the temple to the Negro people, because they are denied certain things. And it says there are statements in our literature by the early brethren which we have interpreted to mean that the Negroes would not receive the priesthood immortality. I have said the same things, and people write me letters saying, you said such and such, and how is it now that we do such and such? And all I can say is that it is time disbelieving people repented and got in line and believed in our living modern prophet. Forget everything that I have said, or what President Brigham Young or President George Q. Cannon or whomsoever has said in days past is contrary to the present revelation. We spoke with limited understanding and without the light and knowledge that now has come into the world. We get our truth in the light, line upon line and precept upon precept, and we have now had it added a new flood of intelligence and light upon this particular subject, and it erases all the darkness and all the views and all the thoughts of the past. They don't matter anymore. That's pretty bold for him to own up to, him including himself in those statements. Now, that doesn't just whitewash everything. Now we're all good. That was a lot of work. This wasn't from the pulpit and general conference, but that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and the thing is that I do appreciate that. I think that is a big deal, especially for someone as kind of
it was kind of like we said, he's the Mormon doctrine.
Yeah, he's like he was a very strongly opinionated person. I think the only pushback I would have on that is when he says it erases everything else. There's a 100 years of Black families that aren't sealed, and hold on, let me finish. And right now the membership of the church that's Black is about 3%. So I mean, there is still a lot of work to do to kind of end it. I understand what he's saying. In context, what he's saying is all of those things that other prophets have said with limited knowledge and ignorance and those types of things are no longer an issue. I agree with that, and that's a good step forward. There's just some more.
I think what you're getting at, Josh, is that his audience is the white Utah Saints. His audience isn't the blacks saying, "Hey, you guys just forget about it." If it is, then I agree with you. That's wrong. The blacks can't just forget about it. They suffered through that.
I don't read that. That's what he was saying.
Yeah.
I think with what Dr. Harris said, if he ever watches this, I apologize if I say brothers of doctor at times if you're worried about that. But when he made the comment, what was so miraculous and amazing about that 2012 or 13 essay is that it finally denounced those doctrines. And that's what McConkie is saying. I think where he's saying it doesn't matter. Brother Harris said in the Sunday school, if someone starts talking about that, now you can pull up your phone or whatever in a church and say on the church's website, that's not exactly accurate. So we shouldn't be focusing on that.
How many people would do that?
To me? No, it happens.
I would,
but just saying, I've seen it. I've seen bishops get up and correct speakers from some sacrament. It's awesome. But I'm just saying that when I hear his words where he says it erases all darkness, I think he's talking about the concepts and revelation for people that are actually trying to learn. I don't think he's talking about the policy being erased and the damage done being fixed. But it doesn't matter. We don't need to linger on that. But I think that's a powerful step. Like you said, it's a step.
Yeah, I think that is a step, and progress is often slow.
I've never heard that before, by the way.
Especially in the church.
Yeah, and that's that. But anyway, yeah. So back to what I was saying about the backlash, though, or the wake of whatever you want to call it. It just troubles me because there were some responses that I received that were, from who they came from. I'm not talking about anybody in this room, in this podcast. I'm just saying some of my friends. It showed me that they just didn't. They didn't.
It blows my mind. Like whenever I discover someone that's racist, it really does, because and it blows my mind that such people still exist, but they do. Like for example, one time at work, there was a man that was, one of our coworkers in the church. He had a black wife. I didn't know. So he brings his wife to a party, and we're taking pictures and stuff. And there was a guy that literally refused to be in a picture with his wife because she was black. And it just blew my mind. Like I can't comprehend that kind of a person, but they do exist, and that's what just always surprises me.
Well, that's not what I think bothers me the most. I think what bothers me the most is the people that have a form. I'm not saying they're racist like that, but I'm saying that they don't realize what they're doing is racist.
They have
right?
racist tendencies, like me. I'm racist. I'm being totally serious. I can joke around about it, but I really do have.
But here's the thing, right? Like I think this is racist, capital R, versus doing something racist.
Yeah. Like
I think that there are times, like, for example, I've shared you this story before. I remember being at a Best Buy one time, and it was right near Arco Arena. And this just really tall, athletic-looking black man walked in. And Arco Arena is where the Sacramento Kings used to play. And so I'm like, oh, I wonder if he's on the Kings. And then I stopped and I said, that's kind of racist. Like, this tall black guy walks in, he must play basketball. You know what I mean? One of these tendencies that I had to correct myself, right? So there are things that we do that are kind of prejudiced, it's just kind of in-group bias, kind of stereotypes type stuff. And that's the stuff is that when people say things like people who will say stuff like, oh, well, the church just needs to say that, because the PR and all that, unfortunately the church is getting.
There's animosity somewhere sometimes.
And I kind of look at that and I go, so do you think that black people are cursed? Do you think that, you know what I mean? And when you ask them that question, do you think that black people were less valiant in the pre-existence? So you think that black people are genetically predisposed
Well, and I think that part of the reason they believe that is racism, but another part is because, again, it goes towards, if we admit that black people are not any of those things, then what we're saying is that we aren't following Brigham Young. We aren't following a prophet
Yeah.
who, uphold, what's the
Upheld.
word? Upheld those doctrines when they were in, the presidency or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a double struggle there.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that, and I think that has. I mean, I think that at least from what I gathered from Dr. Harris, although I don't know if he said it, but I don't know if he said it as I'm saying it, and that is that that is part of the reason why I think it took so long for the church to change this. If you listen to the podcast, you'll or you read the book, you'll see that there were many apostles and prophets who wanted to change this over the course of time. And it just didn't happen. And it was actually this doctrine, and maybe this is a good time to go over just briefly the chronology.
Yeah.
But
well, before we shift into there, I just want to cap off this last. I don't think we want to talk more about racism. It does exist, but Brother Harris did reference this talk, and I wanted to share just the little part of it, a very small part, where President Hinckley talked about, and this was a reaction. Brother Harris talked about how this was weighing on him. He was getting letters from members and with frustration about them still being taught in gospel doctrine and things, and saying, does the church still believe this? And he was like having a hard time going back and criticize. I don't know about criticism. Again, Brother Harris mentions it way better, describes it way better. But he was an institutionalist, is what he said. And President Hinckley wasn't going to get into the habit of going back and start breaking down who said what was offensive, which person said which things that were wrong, and when were they not a problem, all that stuff. He wasn't going to open up that can of worms. This statement isn't about that, but this caps up what we were just talking about racism, and I think this is a really important piece. And so I hope you guys can hear a little bit. It's just really, really short.
Racial strife still lives its ugly head. I am advised that even right here among us there is some of this. I cannot understand how it can be. It seemed to me that we all rejoiced in the 1978 revelation given President Kimball. I was there in the temple at the time that happened. There was no doubt in my mind or in the minds of my associates that what was revealed was the mind and the will of the Lord. Now I am told that racial slurs and denigrating remarks are sometimes heard among us. I remind you that no man who makes disparaging remarks concerning those of another race can consider himself a true disciple of Christ, nor can he consider himself to be in harmony with the teachings of the Church of Christ. How can any man holding the Melchizedek priesthood arrogantly assume that he is eligible for the priesthood, whereas another who lives a righteous life but whose skin is of a different color is ineligible?
I'll end it right there. I'm sorry you guys couldn't hear it. That's one thing about the StreamYard is weird with that. But he was basically testifying. He said, I was there in the room, in the temple, when it happened. And he expressed he knew it was from God, but he's still hearing that there's still racial issues and people still having all this deliberation where people are criticizing other people. He goes on to other places in the rest of the talk too, where there's animosity, there's hatred, there's frustration, and there's condescendency where people think they're more righteous because of their skin color. And he's condemning that people, if they feel like that they're not worthy of the priesthood, if they're sitting there feeling like they're more superior because of someone else's skin color, when that person is living righteously, that is unbecoming of our covenants, it's unbecoming of the priesthood. It's really good. But this is the talk that Brother Harris referenced. I apologize if you guys couldn't hear it. But it's called The Need for Greater Kindness, 2012, I think it was. But it's very good. What's that?
I'm pretty sure he was dead by 2012.
Sorry.
2006.
Yeah.
So
Anyway,
let me
let's go
address-
ahead and do this. Let's go and move into the history a little bit, just
well,
briefly. Go ahead,
real,
Josh.
real quick. Last thing I'm going to say about that, and this is just anecdotal, but just a highlight.
Uh-huh.
And I shared this on my podcast. You know, there were two black men. One was actually from, I believe it was Ghana, and was one of the first members of the church to be baptized in Ghana. And he was in our stake, in our ward. He was called to leadership position along with another black man. And there was a member of the church who wrote a letter to the stake presidency talking about that black men should not be in leadership positions in the church because they shouldn't be holding the priesthood. And that was in the mid 2000s, right around the time that this was coming out. So this was needed. You know, this talk was needed.
Well, it's still needed, and with what President Nelson has come out and the statements he's had to make, which we all know people ignore because President Nelson told everybody to get the COVID vaccine and they ignored that. But still, at least he came out and said racism was bad, stop doing it, and it is still a challenge, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? This is part of the challenge of hearing stuff like this, right? Is it calls into question, how do you know when a prophet is speaking as a prophet and not? And actually, Dr. Harris did talk about that on the podcast because that changed over the course of time as well. But as far as the chronology, what I found really fascinating about this was that this doctrine was controversial from the very start. I mean, that's what it sounds like. I mean, as soon as Brigham Young died, everybody was kind of like, so where did this come from? And Brigham Young did suggest at times that Joseph Smith had done this, but there was had brought it up, but there is no evidence at all, other than stuff from the Pearl of Great Price, of any sort of document or anything that shows a revelation where Joseph Smith withheld the priesthood. In fact, withheld the priesthood from black people. In fact, quite the contrary. There's evidence to show that he did give the priesthood to black people.
Yeah.
So,
and he said they looked. He said Joseph Fielding. He said they looked in those one of the letters. Yeah,
for a long time and couldn't find it. Yeah. So there was a question within even the Quorum of the 12 whether this was a doctrine or just a policy and a practice.
So let's talk about that real quick. What's the difference?
So
this is a great part of the story. I would love this.
Yeah. So according to Dr. Harris, a doctrine is something, well, that's changed over time too. So it initially was if a prophet said it over the pulpit at general conference, it was doctrine. Then it changed.
Hang on, you said the prophet.
Right. Then it was if the first presidency in accord sign a document, it becomes or affirms it, then it is a doctrine. It is since, and I think he said it was 2011 or 2012, D. Todd Christofferson said that when it's the quorum of the first presidency and the quorum of the 12, then it's a doctrine.
Yeah.
So that's changed over time too. But basically at this point, there was no evidence connecting this to actual doctrine. So there were members of the quorum of the 12 up until 1949 that thought it was just a policy and a practice, meaning it wasn't actual doctrine. It was just a policy of the church. The difference is that a policy can be changed by the prophet, and a doctrine requires a revelation, meaning it has to be unanimous by the quorum, the first presidency, the quorum of the 12. So, if it's a policy to practice, the church can the prophet can just change it.
Now, I just want to stop on that for just a second. That's a big deal to me. And in this story, a lot of people, the big question comes up: were they racist? Was it about the what's it called? The civil rights movement, all that stuff? How much of that was influential? Brother Harris really points out it's very, very, very influential in the 12, especially during the 60s, 50s, 60s. And what I love about hearing this side of it, when you hear the points of these different men, Brigham Young and where it came from originally, okay, that aside, because they couldn't figure it out. But between David O. McKay and then Joseph Fielding and then President Lee, who's my favorite prophet, and then President Kimball actually rebanned it, you had this bookended where, from if I remember the chronology, McKay wanted it to be disbanded, but so he couldn't do it because of the too much. He couldn't fight against Joseph Fielding because he was so influential. And then Joseph Fielding thought it was a revelation had to be done. Elder Lee thought the same thing, and then President Kimball's the one that had been waiting for him to be in the driver's seat so he could fix it. But what I appreciated about hearing this story was it wasn't that some of them were racist, some of them were just opposed to it, some of them were their political views, whatever aside. It was just this concept that you're saying. Was it a doctrine or was it a policy? And they both stuck to their gun, or all of them stuck to their guns on if they felt it was a revelation, misconstrued as it may have been, coming from false pretenses as it may have been. I don't know.
I think that's
it's relevant.
I think that's given them too much of a softball, personally.
Well, no.
And he spoke about it too. That it's sort of unfair to say. I mean, to me, it's a silly conversation because, and this is why it's silly to say, well, is it doctrine or is it policy? If it stops people from doing what they should be doing, if it causes harm, if it on the ground causes actions that are not good, what does it matter if it's policy or doctrine? It's still bad. It needs to change.
But the 12 have to follow very specific
excuses. Stop making excuses for it. That's how I feel about it.
Well, and he said in the podcast, and Josh, I'm sorry for giving you this much of my time, but I've listened to it 3 times now because I wanted to kind of get the history in my head. Not because you're so awesome,
but I am. But anyway,
but as he goes to the story, it's never a distasteful, this one was opposed to it, whatever. But like we talked about having historian. Well, this was off camera or off air. There's kind of the scholarly, not historians, but the scholarly doctrinal powerhouses in the 12. They always kind of have one. Right now, it's kind of Elder Rokes. Before that was McConkie. Before that was Joseph Fielding Smith. When you go read Doctrines of Salvations and Answers to the Gospel Questions, all those things, and Book of Mormon, or the New Testament commentaries and the Mortal Messiah series, all that stuff, those were by those powerhouses. So when you have someone like Joseph Fielding Smith, who has this context or this idea on the table about this decision about the policy as an apostle and then as a prophet, he's like he's sticking to his guns. It does make a difference to someone that's that deep into it that it has to follow the proper procedure for a revelation to come and change it.
Well, I look at it as like the David conundrum. You have David who defeated Goliath, who said some amazing things and gave some amazing teachings. He was also a murderer. He murdered someone. You can't. Yeah. And so people in their minds, it's like either one or the other. He can't be David to beat Goliath and the murderer at the same time. But that's how people are, and that's how some prophets have been.
Yeah, you're telling me I'm the one that defends Bill Cosby, the Cosby Show, not Bill Cosby.
Well, it's called, we call whole object relations, right? Which means that you're either all good or all bad, and you can't be both. And that's what I think. That's what I think. Why so many people have this concept is so hard, and that's really been the hardest thing about this whole wake or whatever of this podcast, and many like it, is that there's just no room in a lot of people's heads. It kind of shows a little bit of emotional immaturity, right? In that you can't hold both in your head at the same time. So like, was Brigham Young racist? Okay, well, what do you think? He was a white man in 1850. They all were racist.
Yeah.
Of course he was racist. What, right. You think because he was a prophet, he was president of the church in Utah, that he was an exception to the rule? No. And that's the thing, is that like, this is another thing I don't understand, and about, you and I, Tim, have had a lot of fiery discussions about Mormon culture, right?
This is fiery.
Well, we've had some pretty.
Oh, really?
This is something that's really frustrating for me, is that like, members of the church have no problem, in my experience, bagging on Saul, bagging on David, bagging on Noah for getting drunk and getting put into his tent and then casting his grandkid out forever. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have any problem with those prophets. But man, don't you dare say anything about any modern day prophet that could have suggested that they did something wrong. Like, that's the thing. Like, why is it that we view the modern day prophets even more so than the biblical prophets above reproach? Like, do we think that Peter was above reproach for denying the Savior 3 times? No, he shouldn't have done it once. He did it 3 times. Does that
But
mean
the Lord withheld the best prophets for the end. That's why.
Well, and Jesus addressed this topic in the New Testament where he said, it's easy to believe old and dead prophets, but it's not easy to believe them when
Absolutely, a good point.
they're the carpenter's son, from down in the city.
Well,
So,
that's true, but I find it. What I think, and this is just my opinion, okay. And some people don't like when I say this, but I think it's true, okay. I think sometimes when people argue these points, defend what I view to be indefensible positions, it is because of their own insecurities than it really is about anything else. Because listen, I can hold it in my head that Brigham Young was a white man in 1850, was racist, and also could have been a prophet.
Yeah.
Okay? But for some reason, there are members of the church and ex-members of the church who can't hold both of those in the same place. So if you're talking to someone who's left the church, nope, he was a racist, therefore he was all bad. Right? Everything he did was bad. None of it could be true. If he messed up one thing, then nothing he said could be true. Right? Whereas and I got to say, it's not just like messing up one thing. This is a huge thing that had a huge impact for a century. So I'm not trying to trivialize what he did, but my point is that it doesn't mean that both can't be true. You don't have to believe it, right?
Right.
True.
But don't bag on other people. I think this is my problem. This is I've been going back and forth with this dude I don't even know on TikTok, and it's really a waste of my time. But like
I just told you before, I understand engaging comments and stuff on like YouTube and stuff and addressing things, but I'm like, but TikTok people, it's like, why not share your political views on Twitter? It's the same thing.
Let me just say, like, here's what usually happens, right, on TikTok, because there's a big ex-Mormon community on TikTok. Yeah. And once they get a hold of one of my stuff, my Mormon ones, they just have a field day. Okay. And what happens is they'll say something snide, like a drive-by, I call it drive-by comments, right? Like a drive-by shooting. They just drive by and say something nasty, right?
Yeah.
But then I usually respond with something like, so are you trying to engage in constructive conversation or are you just trolling?
Yeah.
And then if they say something snide, like, oh, I'm just trolling, okay, leave it alone. But sometimes they'll be like, well, okay. And I actually have a decent conversation with somebody and I go, okay. They're surprised because they're used to the member who won't acknowledge anything they say is true. Right. And so when I sit there and I say, yeah, that's a problem. I acknowledge it. I get it. Yeah. I just don't agree. We walk away. There's a guy though who just like, he didn't listen to the podcast. He heard 1 minute and he just assumed all these things.
Yeah.
And I say, well, why don't you listen to the podcast? Because that's not exactly what happened. Nope, I don't need to. I don't need to listen. I know exactly. He was trained to BYU, so I know how it is. And then he said something like, my dad was a general authority. Oh, okay, so you know better because your dad was a general authority. You know what I mean? Like, and so it's just
what I just say that general authorities and professors at BYU have all been excommunicated in the past. That doesn't
right. And so that's what I'm saying, right? That's part of the thing that really bothers me about this is that there's no room for these people to have intelligent discussion.
There's no nuance.
No, there's no nuance. Like I 100% can sympathize and understand why someone might hear this stuff and it may shake their faith, or it may cause them to doubt, or may cause them hurt. And I understand that, right? I 100% understand it. That doesn't mean that I can't still believe that the church is true just because the atonement applies to the church just as much as it does to the individual, right?
I hope so.
Well, yeah.
And Lance knows he works for the church. He sees the underside of the.
Well, but let's. Made. I mean, all of this sort of, in a lot of ways, dances, and you brought it up in your podcast. It dances around the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is. And this is why I tie it into Revelation. The elephant in the room is people want easy revelation. And easy revelation looks like this. God talks to a prophet. The prophet tells everybody how it's going to be. And that's what God wants. And we're done. We just do whatever he says. That's actually one of the reasons that I love the church so much is our church is different in one distinct way in that it says, hey, here's a prophet. he's going to receive revelation, but the responsibility of finding out whether it's true or not is yours. And by the way, for your life, in order to be saved, you have to receive personal revelation. You cannot be saved by only following the prophet.
Right.
And that's, to me, that's huge. And what happens is now the elephant in the room is, well, if the prophet was wrong on this thing, what else is he wrong on? And that's really where the big struggle is.
Before we move on with, I think, where this conversation is going to go with what you just said, I want to share this quote too. This is by President Nelson. And I've tried to allude to this in conversation with Josh, but I couldn't find it. I finally found it because I thought it was Bednar and I thought it was Eyring, but it was Nelson. And this was in the talk when he welcomed Elder Gong and Soares. He says,
hey, we're not all white anymore.
He says, he's describing the inner workings of those councils. He said, when we convene as a council of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12, our meeting rooms become rooms of revelation. The Spirit is palpably present. Big difference. The Spirit is palpably present. As we wrestle with complex matters, a thrilling process unfolds as each apostle freely expresses his thoughts and point of view. Though we may differ in our initial perspectives, the love we feel for each other is constant. Our unity helps us discern the Lord's will for his church. I like that, the unity. Josh, you and I were going to talk about that. In our meetings, the majority never rules. We listen prayerfully to one another and talk with each other until we are united. And then when we have reached a complete accord, the unifying influence of the Holy Ghost is tingling. We experience what the prophet Joseph Smith knew when he taught, by union of feeling we obtain power with God. No member of the First Presidency or Quorum of the 12 would ever leave decisions for the Lord's church to his own best judgment. And I'm not going to play the clip because you guys can't hear it, but that he describes when Brother Harris describes in one of your questions, Josh, he talks about the institutional revelation.
Some people, members of the church, are going to listen to this and they're going to say, well, wait a minute, I thought God's leading this church and blah, 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 blah. And I don't want to go too deep into faith, but tell me what you've gleaned from how the church is governed at the top, from the stuff that you've read, these personal diaries. I mean, it sounds to me what you're saying is you've had access to documents that literally no one else on this subject has been able to see, including personal diaries of people agonizing over this very issue. What do you think you've learned about how the church is organized and ran from your scholarship?
That's a great question. It's a really good question. Well, in President Kimball's case, what I've learned is how active this revelation was. And I think Latter-day Saints have a mistaken view of what revelation is, at least institutional revelation. And I think it's illustrated by the story you just shared with your stake president, that Jesus just appears to him and tells him what to do that day. And obviously there's some hyperbole, with your stake president, I'm sure. But the point is that, Jesus is talking to him, God, directly, daily or weekly or something. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. What I'm saying is with institutional revelation, that it's active on the part of the person seeking the revelation, meaning that revelation is consensus in the church. It's not some thunderbolt from God. It's not some cosmic script telling you what to do. It's a person who's led by the Holy Spirit, that feeling in your heart that what you're doing is the right thing. And institutional revelation it really revolves around debate and discussion. And once the debate, the discussion occurs over a problem like the ban, they agree, I think we should probably lift the ban after lots of debate and discussion. And then it typically, okay, let's pray about this. And then after the prayer, the president says, I feel like this is what we need to do. That's what becomes the revelation. Mm-hmm. And I think with personal revelation from either the scriptures or Joseph Smith, there's a couple of familiar things in the church. One would be the still small voice, right? 2 Nephi. Another one would be sudden strokes of influence. That's Joseph Smith. He writes about that. that we have these, sudden strokes of influence in our mind, which I think is great. But that's not institutional revelation. It's the 12 meeting together, debating and discussing an issue. And those are Hugh Brown's words, by the way, debating and discussing an issue. Those aren't my words. So Hugh Brown said that we debate, we discuss an issue, then we vote on it, then we pray about it, and then the president says, I feel inspired to say this is what we need to do. And Brown wrote in his autobiography, Brown said, that's what becomes a revelation in the church. And that's exactly what happened to a T with the priesthood revelation.
That's when it becomes doctrine. And he
However,
says
let me break
how
in.
it happened.
Let me break in there for a second. I know because President Irene and President Bednar and not President Bednar, Elder Bednar and Elder Gong have said it. So three, it's just my word, but that discussion that you just described, that is not like,
it's not all fluffy and happy.
Yeah.
And, yeah,
fact,
I know.
There are very, very strong opinions, and there's intense debate. And I have heard from multiple sources that there's literally swearing sometimes. They say swear words.
They've talked about that in conference, not swearing, but they've talked what you're describing. They've said that in conference. Those were some of the quotes I was looking for too. But that doesn't change this narrative that the deliberation could be heated, I'm sure.
No, but this was new to me. Like, literally in the last 3 years, I had no idea that kind of level of discussion happened in the Quorum of 12 Apostles, and I had no idea that they had to make decisions unanimously. I didn't know that. And I don't think majority of church members do either. Again, I think they're used to this top-down revelation. This is how it happens, and everyone's just on the same page. And I think it's important for us to mature beyond that and realize that that's not how things happen. Why is it important? Because we need to do the same thing in our own quorums. And the church is moving away from that, where it's not the sage on the stage. I think it was President Irene, and I love what he says, that revelation is scattered amongst us. And so we need to speak up, we need to speak out, and we need to come together and not, just sit there with our mouths open and wait for something to happen.
Well, let me something on that, because I think there were a couple of points I wanted to make. I agree with a lot of what you said about the scattering revelation, because sometimes when I've heard this before and I've used it when I'm teaching gospel doctrine, I tell people, I go, listen, if a comment popped into your head, you should share it. And the reason that is because maybe God through you is giving you revelation that someone else needs to hear. Right. And when people do that, the discussion gets very good. Now, here's the other thing I would say about that institutional revelation, because I was thinking about this, because that was something that I had never really considered before either, because the way he described it was, he said, they have intense debate and discussion. And then once they have the discussion and they get in the same page, there's a prayer. And then the prophet says, this is what I feel I'm getting revelation that we should do. Then they vote on it again. Pray again. I mean, it's a long process, right?
Yeah, and it's not just that meeting. They will have, and you mentioned it a little bit, it can be meetings over a year's stretch before they finally come to that unanimity on a decision.
And I think my point is that some people may be concerned about this, right? But if anybody who's been in a bishopric or an elders quorum presidency or any of those things, that is how it works in all of these things. My next door neighbor is my former stake president, and he said this best, and I even shared it on my podcast. He said, I think the members think that Russell M. Nelson wakes up and has a 3-hour interview with the Savior every day, tells him exactly what he's supposed to do, and he goes and does it. And that's just not how it works, right? And I think what you need to realize is that the same spirit that teaches your bishop who needs to be the elders quorum president, who needs to be the primary teacher, is the same spirit that teaches the quorum of the 12. And the thing is that also sometimes you get it wrong. I mean, let's put it this way. How many times have you in your life, if you're a member of the church and you're listening to this, I want to ask you, and I can tell you from myself, this is something I struggle with the most. Really, out of all the doctrines of the church, I think this is the one I struggle with the most. How many times have you gotten revelation or feel you've gotten revelation and you didn't follow it, or you questioned whether it was really revelation or not? You don't think that happens to the quorum of the 12?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well,
Especially,
and a harder thing, even harder concept to realize, and I think Elder Holland, when he talked about driving down the road and going down the wrong path, you remember that story?
Yeah.
Because he received revelation to turn right and it led to a dead end. And they're like, well, did we receive false revelation? I think the Lord allows us to fall up. Like he allows us to make mistakes so that we can grow. And, is receiving that kind of revelation is the toughest, right? And that requires the most faith, in my opinion.
yeah, and I think that's my point, right? Is that like, the Lord, I can remember in my life a couple of decisions, big decisions, where I did not listen to what I felt was revelation. And then the thing happened that I think needed to happen, and it was grossly more painful than it would have been had I just listened, right? And how do we know that that's not necessarily, I mean, could that have happened in this situation? I don't know. I don't know what the real issue is. We know it was a mistake, but why it happened, you're just guessing, right? And I guess my point is that yeah, like my point is there's a number of how do I say this? It's just one of these, it's a situation where where sometimes we just get it wrong, and I think that happens at all levels of the church, and I think we have to be okay with that.
Well, that's exactly why we have a quorum. That's exactly why we don't just have a prophet. The quorum is there for a purpose.
Yeah.
That protection.
Can I throw a comment out there about this? Came up in your discussion. I don't remember if we mentioned it just now, but like how it changed. So it used to be the prophet. We started with that when we derailed several times. But you start with the prophet. That was prophetic revelation. That's just what everyone was used to. Then it expanded in the early 1900s, I think, to the quorum of the 12. To the first presidency. They'd write a letter. They'd all sign it. That was doctrine. And then it now expanded to where he said was Christopherson. Where it perked his ears, he said, he said it's, I can't remember who it was, but it was the quorum of the 12 and the first presidency all in unison. And that's one of the things that whoever it was said that, or who made a promise in the story that to President Kimball, he was going to get it done, but he couldn't fight whoever was under Elder Lee, President
Lee Brown on his
Lee Brown. He said, I'm not going to push with President Lee because we have to. I'm the president of the 12. We have to work in unison. But as I thought about why did it change, this is just a thought, and I don't know, but I don't think it's just they're like, well, this isn't working. But if you think about it, when you go back on April 6, 1830, there's 6 members of the church. They don't have a quorum of 12 apostles. They're not representing like different nations and everything. It's Joseph and the first and second elder, right? And Oliver. And then later on, as the church grows, okay, now we have the quorum of the 12 apostles, and they were the ones leading and guiding. So then it becomes a bigger national church, and then it comes in an international. And now we have apostles from other nations. And he shared that story with Elder Holland, where the guy approached him at Lowe's saying, when are we going to get a black apostle? He said, he's not saying this as a prophet, but he said, when we have more black members, we'll consider it. I think the representation aspect is valid. I think the representation where you have, a church that's so big, the first presidency is writing doctrine, but now you need to have more deliberation. And Josh, you said on your channel, do you think there is a point where they do get a little bit disassociated on the ground level, what members are going through? We're getting letters that there's still racism being taught in Sunday school, and that's shaking President Hinckley in the 2000s. I think that's a relevant part. And so having people representing different nations, the expansion of this quorum of the 70s, where we have like 6 of them, it's for that reason, because it's a networking process. They don't just magically know everything. They're not omniscient to the world. They have to do research. They have counselors. They have people who are helping them as they do their traveling. They need to get fed information.
That's actually what Elder Gong's job was before he became an apostle.
You knew him, huh? Or yeah.
No, I didn't know him personally.
Not personally, but you worked with him.
His job was to go in and inform the first presidency and the quorum of 12 apostles about certain things. I'm not sure exactly what, but they have these people that are like, go in to give briefs about, goings on in the world. It's interesting that Elder Holland said that, though, because I would counter with, well, why do you have a Chinese apostle? Because there's not very many Chinese members of the church, Elder Holland. So I think part of it is that the Lord is
Preparing
pushing his work forward faster than maybe we would like in our comfort zones.
Well, yeah, this as you were talking, Tim, and I'm not trying to undercut what you were saying about maybe this is why it changed
I don't know. It was a thought.
I think that's a danger that I think permeates the churches when things do change, or things don't make sense. We try to fit them into making sense. Like I see this often with, really more than anything, kind of like polygamy is a big one, where they're like, well, I think this is maybe why they had polygamy, and this is the reason why God had polygamy, and maybe this is why Joseph Smith married a 14-year-old girl, like just stuff like that. And I go, I just think that if we're guessing, like all of those things are guesses, and I don't think that does any help. I don't know.
It kind of makes sense. That's why I was throwing it out there. It's a thought that made sense to me. I don't think it's like, well, apparently they didn't know how to make Revelation back in the 1900s because they didn't have the 12 involved, or apparently now we're trying to attach the 12 to the first presidency when that's all we need, or maybe only the prophets when that's necessary. I think the Lord, especially depending on the times, depending on who he has there, the church has evolved, and I don't think there's that they were doing it wrong at different points necessarily.
No, I don't.
We don't have any idea.
Yeah,
I don't think there's anything damaging in my speculation as a thought there.
Oh no, I'm not saying there was. I'm not saying there was. I don't think that you did any damage there. I'm just saying, when we do have that tendency when things change to try to explain away the change, and I just don't think that really matters. Like, does it?
No.
Does it really matter why it changed? No, it changed, so that's how it is now. And if you
I never thought about it till it came up in that discussion. I thought it was fascinating that when he said his ears perked up because he spent his life studying this stuff and researching the letters and what came. So when it caught his interest, then it caught my interest. I was like, well, why did it change?
Well,
that's the time I guess a couple of months ago.
To me, the answer, Josh, is yes, it does matter. It matters to me why the Lord does the things he does. It matters to me why, because we have to make judgment calls, right, in our lives, and having an understanding of why things happen sometimes gives us deeper insight into whether or not it's a good judgment call or a bad judgment call, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think that's also the thing that's interesting about this, and I was going to actually say this, when you were talking about Revelation and all this stuff, I think I didn't make the point, but it's like, what happens? Like, I can tell you the hardest revelation when I feel like I'm getting it. The hardest ones are the ones that don't make sense to me. Right? Like, when I get them, I just go, that doesn't make any sense. That's gotta be me. Well, imagine you've got, you have 100 years of precedent in front of you, right? And you're getting a revelation that this needs to change. How hard that would be.
Yeah, and by the way, all of your or two or three of the apostles are going to totally disagree with you.
Right, but yeah, and that's what I'm saying though is you're sitting here and you're saying, well, wait a minute. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. Brigham Young said this. The guy who built our temple that we're sitting in, he said this, and we think Joseph Smith even said it, even though we can't prove it. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to overturn what these two prophets, who are the most seminal prophets to the creation of what we hold dear, we're going to overrule what they've done for 100 years because some people outside the church are saying that we should. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm not trying to. I want to say I am not trying to say that like justify what they're doing or anything, because it was wrong from the beginning. It should have never even been there. That's my opinion, and it seems to be that's the church's opinion now. So I'm not trying, but I'm just saying, like, if you're the concept of revelation is so hard because it's not always a burning in the bosom and clear as day that you're getting a revelation. Sometimes it is, right? But sometimes it's not, and you're left to wonder, okay, do I take do I have faith that this is revelation? And I've had friends that have had the craziest revelations that nobody believes is actual revelation.
For more of those stories, go to Edlow Podcast.
I have one. I've been trying to get him on. I think I get him on one day. He had this. It was the craziest story I'd ever heard, and it was just amazing. I was like, I gotta have you on. I gotta know where you came up with this.
Well, and for me, that's a very personal thing because literally false revelation is one of the major wedges that drove my father and mother to get a divorce. And so I know very intimately that people can and will receive false revelation. And the amount of damage it can do is astounding. Imagine the amount of damage false revelation does, and this is a perfect example on a wider scale. And so and that again makes revelation sound very scary, which is why it really requires, the opposite of fear is faith, right? Revelation really requires a lot of faith.
Yeah, and I want to say, I just got this impression to say this, and I don't know if it's helpful or not.
Did you get revelation? Would you say?
Yeah, I don't know, but I just thought of this, because like if there's somebody out there who's listening to this and they're faithful members of the church, and this is bringing some harm to them, particularly if there's a black member listening to this, this is a frustrating, because I mean we got 3 white guys here talking about this.
We're solving it. We're fixing it all.
Not that should matter, because I think it's important to everybody, and justice anywhere is justice everywhere, right? So, but I would like to say that I do believe the atonement can fix these problems. And if you look at things in the eternal perspective, not to say that this doesn't create a whole lot of harm and it's unfair and it's wrong, but in the scope of eternity, 100 years is not that long. And so hopefully, the atonement in one day can correct the harms, even if they haven't been yet.
Can I ask you, Josh, to elaborate with your point, because you had a good conversation with Patrick Mason about it too. The footnote on the official declaration about polygamy, I think it was that one, right? Was it Wilford Woodruff, where he talks about how the Lord will not allow? I'll let you elaborate. But my thought about this with what you just said, that yes, there was 100 years of major misbelief, and he said it's not some small thing. That's what Martin Harris. That's what Brother Harris said. There were some serious, severe consequences and results from this policy in place. But what you just said is so important, and I think this is the backbone and the spirit behind that statement. I'll let you explain that the Lord is not going to allow the church to completely derail and the prophets to completely derail with anything that's going to be destructive, that his plan, including, or which is fixed and empowered by the atonement, can't resolve. And it could be devastating and it can be horrific. And it doesn't mean we're making excuses or justifying that this was right or that it was God's will. But the things that the prophets are doing in the best capacity they can, in their best interest, or intending in their best intentions, I'm trying to say, that the Lord he is in control. And if there's someone that is going to completely change and erase, including possibly, maybe that's why President Lee's presidency was so short, to get Kimball in there to make this change. Who knows? But he is in all control. And if there's someone he doesn't want at the head of the presidency or at the head of the apostleship or as a prophet, he has it all under his control. He's allowing us to make mistakes. He's allowing us to make course corrections, including the prophets. So I believe the spirit behind that statement is that he is in control. He's not saying they're infallible. And your description of that in your episode, not that you're saying it wrong, because I believe members do feel that way, but I've never interpreted that statement to be like, oh, they're just perfect. Everything they do is right. But I'll let you talk about that, because I know you're pretty passionate about that concept.
Well, hold on. I want to follow up too with the same comment that you and Josh have been made about the atonement, and I want to expand it a little bit too. If you're a member of the church or not a member of the church or interested in the church, and you feel harmed by the church, and you feel like very, very left out of the conversation, like transgenders, like homosexuals, like many people that feel very, very like offended by the church, I would just encourage you to reach out to Jesus Christ and to feel his love and the power of his atonement, which you can feel now. And you don't need to have anyone agree with you in the church in order to feel the atonement of Jesus Christ. I know of no dependency in anywhere in the scriptures where it says, in order to have the healing and comfort of the atonement, you have to agree with the church in any way, shape, or form.
Lance, with what you just said, I just want to read this real quick. This is President Uchtdorf. I've shared this parts of this with multiple times, sometimes with conversation with Josh, and I've done it online before. He says, some might say, I just don't fit in with you people in the church. If you could see into our hearts, you would probably find out you fit in better than you suppose. You might be surprised to find that we have yearnings and struggles and hopes similar to yours. Your back, and this is an important part for Josh. I mean, he believes in this. Your background and upbringing might seem different from what you perceive as many Latter-day Saints, but that could be a blessing. Brothers and sisters, dear friends, we need your unique talents and perspectives. The diversity of persons and peoples all around the globe is a strength in this church. And I don't believe he's just talking about race and culture. Different issues and struggles people have, LGBTQ, whatever. But then he says, some might say, I think I could live up to your standards. And this is the point with what Lance just said. All the more reason to come. The church is designed to nourish the imperfect, the struggling, and the exhausted. It is filled with people who desire with all their heart to keep the commandments, even if they haven't mastered it. The rest of this talk is so powerful and eloquent with what you just said, Lance. But the atonement is what matters. And it does talk. There's a part where it talks about the history and that struggle. I'll say right here, it is unfortunate that some have stumbled because of the mistakes made by men. But in spite of this, the eternal truth was restored. The gospel found in the Church of Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints, it is not tarnished, diminished, or destroyed. And then he testifies of that. He talks about the history issues. But anyway, I completely agree with that, Lance, and thank you for stopping to elaborate on that, because we don't have all the answers. You or the three of us don't know everything, but we all feel the same way we do about.
We only know most of the answers.
Yeah. But we know how we feel personally about the Savior, and that changes, that shifts. But that's why I started at the beginning of this, because you two are some of the people that I lean on the most. Not that I have faith crises or anything, but I like bouncing feelings and ideas and concepts and reactions to teachings off you guys.
Well, I hope you have faith. I hope I have faith crises, and I hope everyone does, because
I just say, yeah.
Then what's the point of being here? Like, we're not here for vacation, right?
But the atonement is so essential, and anyone that struggles with things, anyone that has a hard time with things that we talked about or things that came out of Josh's podcast, what Lance just said is the most important thing. The atonement can heal hearts, and that your relationship with God, even if Josh believes this, I have different feelings about it. Even if that means you might need to step aside from the church for a time, figure stuff out, whatever, find support, whatever. There's still a path. There's always a path to get back to Christ through the ordinances, through the true teachings of the church, and whatever that path takes you. There's still the ordinances and the principles that will get you back to the presence of the Father. So Josh, I'm sorry, I'll let you go back to what you're going to say. How do you feel about that, with that statement by President Woodruff? Go ahead and elaborate whatever you want to say, because I know you believe in this very strongly.
Yeah, I think Patrick, if you can find the 1 minute reel of him saying this on all the social media stuff that I mentioned, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all that stuff. But he essentially said that we often use this term that God will never allow a prophet to lead the church astray.
It's actually not our theology that prophets can never speak error. It's not our theology that prophets can never teach error. We oftentimes cite the footnotes to the manifesto, to Official Declaration 1. Where Wilford Woodruff says God will never allow me or any person to lead this church astray. That's not a statement of prophetic infallibility. That's a statement of faith in God at the helm. That because we can demonstrate in many occasions where leaders of the church have said things that were in contradiction with one another, where they disagreed or where they said things were just patently false. But what President Woodruff is saying there is not that God constrains their agency so that they can never speak falsehood. It's that it's that the church's truthfulness and God's work, the project of the restoration, is bigger than any one sentence that comes out of a prophet's mouth.
Now, the problem is that many general authorities within the church have used it in a way to suggest prophetic infallibility. And also, I do believe that the church, at least in my generation in the 90s when I grew up, it was a situation where if the prophet said it, you were to follow it. And a lot of members kind of have done that, like the part that Lance eloquently brought up, which is the actual doctrine of the church, which is that you go and pray and get revelation that these things are true yourself. A lot of people have foregone. There was kind of a sense of like, well, I don't need to go and pray. I have more faith than that. I already know that anything that the prophet said to me is true. So I'm going to follow everything he says because I'm that faithful. And again, it's been taught in our gospel doctrine classes and over the pulpit and at general conference and everywhere that somehow a prophet would not say something that would be out of turn. And that's just not true.
Well, I think there's some nuance to this. I think that, let me just put out a hypothetical. Okay, so I'm sitting up in my office in the church office building. President Nelson, which by the way isn't in the church office building, but follow me. He comes down and he says, Lance, get out of the building. It's going to be struck. I've received revelation. It's going to be struck by a meteor, and you have 30 seconds. I'm not going to sit there and be like, hold on, President Nelson, I'm going to pray about this. Like, it's tactical revelation, right? We get out. And then, you get out of the building, and the assumption is it blows up or whatever. That's completely different than, President Nelson coming and saying, hey, within the next 2 years, you all need to move to Missouri. You have plenty of time at that point to get your own personal confirmation, right, which is necessary. And as I would argue is exactly what President Nelson would want you to do in any of the prophets. Why? Because it gives you a strength of that, and it doesn't put all the responsibility and weight on them. And all of a sudden you're supporting them, not because you were forced to, but because you believe yourself. And you
have that pattern with Nephi and Sam mostly Nephi following Lehi and all the challenges that he threw his family through because of revelation from God. The whole time Laman and Lemuel, they didn't take the time to do anything more than just do whatever
Lehi
the Spirit
was like, said. Nephi and Sam, you guys are such a breath of fresh air because you put in the effort, and I don't have to drag you along. The other thing I will say is I totally believe that if a prophet got on the pulpit and said something that was going to lead this church into destruction, that fire would come down from heaven and consume him. Did the revelation on blacks of the priesthood lead the church into destruction? No. So is that a true revelation literally? I think so. Again, there's nuance to it. I don't think it's as black and white as sometimes we want it to be.
Agreed. And that's the thing about doctrine versus and revelation. And he didn't elaborate on any of it, John, on this point, but he said some of the brethren don't agree with President Packer, who said doctrine never changes. That was interesting. But I was like, I have questions. Let me interrupt.
Well, and that's the thing, right? And quite frankly, the evidence is that that's not true. Like that it does change. Because right. I mean, the doctrine of tithing has changed over time.
Have you ever read the Bible? There's a reason there's an Old Testament and a New Testament.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to say. Jesus came and changed the whole religion. I mean,
majorly.
Yeah, I mean, everything changed.
There's a reason we're not sacrificing calves out on our
own. Or we don't have to count our steps on Sunday. You know what I mean? That
was never doctrine, but yeah.
We got the point.
Yeah. So my point is that doctrines can change, and if you are inflexibility results in breaking. And so, if you're flexible and you understand that the beauty of the church. We understand that God has changed his commandments at times based on the needs of the people at the time. Everything's on the table. Everything, in my estimation. And I'm ready for any of it,
Well,
really.
tell me, if polygamy didn't teach you that, then what exactly do you need? That's what I say.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying, is that it can change anything. And so if it changes, you got to be ready for it. And
But the fear is, and again, there's another elephant in the room is, well, what if God tells me to strap a suicide bomb on my chest and go and blow up a trade center? You know, that's so there is a reason we have prophets, and they are important, and there is a balance there that you got to be careful about.
100%. 100%.
I just want to just say that yeah, this statement, I've never heard that or I've never interpreted that to mean that they themselves are infallible or everything they do from the pulpit is infallible. When it says, if I were to attempt,
But there are
Lord,
people that believe that. So
I know, I totally
people
understand that. I'm just saying, like, because Dr. Harris, he brought this up, or you brought it up, and he elaborated on it. He agreed that is something. Oh, I'm sorry, this was Mason's conversation. Sorry. You have so many great speakers, I can't keep track of them, Josh. You're the only recurring one. You're the one I don't want to listen to. But no, it's a really powerful thing, though, because it really does make you consider all of these big issues: black and priesthood, LGBTQ issues, like policies, having 2-hour church. It can be big things or small things, whatever. Mormon doctrine, he's talking about playing cards. If you have playing cards, you're of the devil and all that kind of stuff. Like, and that's not from the pulpit, but I'm just saying, like, having an understanding of that is important. And I think now, like you said at the beginning, Lance, this has become a big issue, that not issue like a problem, but I mean, it's a bigger focus and something that the prophets are really trying to help us to get our grip on, because we need to be able to follow modern day revelation, because challenges are intensifying and changes are coming. And that's what we've seen in the last decade: changes in the church, reformations, and, well, not reformations, but just breaking up of the culture that, Josh, you're a big advocate of that. And there's things that people become uncomfortable with, and there's issues that come up, social issues, that the church has to stand by. Here's the doctrine, we're figuring out the policies, and in the meantime, bear with us. And there's things that we don't, talking about from the brethren, we don't know everything. This transgender thing, this is such a new idea, such a huge and such a fast changing way of life and acceptance in society, that we're trying to adapt and figure where lines are and what we can do. There's only so much. But if we're not like Nephi, praying about the revelations coming from the prophet, even though he knew Lehi was a prophet, that didn't change him having to reaffirm every time something came down, knowing for himself if it was true and keeping that strength to follow. We could get lost. If we're not hung up on the history of the church, we could be hung up on the future changes in the church. Josh, you've challenged me with that yourself. Tim, if they said that we're going to do gay marriage in the temple, what would you be? What would you feel? I'm like, I don't know.
Well, and that's a valid question, right? Is that, I mean, yeah. What, there's so many ways you can go about that, right? I mean, yeah. What are you going to do? What are you going to do if the church comes up and says, yeah, gay people can get married in the temple?
Well, and the opposite is, I think that people shouldn't be surprised if something that the brethren, that the prophet, that the apostles have said, they strongly disagree with it. I think what we need to point out is that doesn't mean that you need to leave the church. Again, I don't want to. We already talked about this, but
good point.
Look at the black people that were faithful members of the church. We got to acknowledge like their faith and their exceptionality of, I couldn't do it. I was straight up. I know. And I'm not just like trying to be humble. I straight up couldn't do it. There's things now that challenge my, political views, like where I'm like, man, this is hard for me to stomach. And I don't know how long I'm going to hang in there, but we should hang in there, because again, if you receive personal revelation that this is the Lord's church, like I have, then you got to stick with it through thick or through
Yeah.
thin. And that doesn't mean you can't, have your
Question.
opinion and
Yeah.
your personality and your beliefs, but
Yeah.
it's not, you can't use as an excuse to say, well, I guess, I'm out of here, man.
And Josh, you and I have had conversations about that in the past where you have the feeling I don't have the same perception, or maybe, and I haven't been exposed. We live very different lifestyles in very different communities. You in California, me in Utah, or whatever. Where you have felt the tone coming from the pulpit is that you should not have questions, not ask questions. You shouldn't let your doubts and fear your doubts. And what I've absorbed is the tone of, it's okay to have questions, just stay faithful and lean on your faith, the things that you do know, until the other things work themselves, or until things are worked out. And we may not get answers to everything that's like weighing on us, but we just have to have faith. Like Lance just said, doesn't mean just bounce out of the church. But I'm sure that there are many people, and probably people that you interact with more, who feel that way, that they're discouraged from asking questions, and it's almost like they're like, oh, you must not have enough faith if something comes up and you had questions about it, that you should never have questions. I don't believe that we're supposed to be blind, just following like sheep. We're supposed to receive revelation, like Lance has said several times, of the things that come out, and follow and be in tune with the Spirit, so we can be able to respond. Because you know what? They could do something that's a mistake. It's happened in the past. Are we going to roll with it? Or are we going to tear up our temple recommends, like with the thing with the policy with the children of gay couples and things like that?
Yeah, I would say, just to clarify my position on that, I don't necessarily think that tone is coming from the pulpit, like I don't know if that's necessarily coming from, say, like prophets. I think that's a good clarification. I think that's more coming from
culture.
The culture.
Okay,
because I've noticed, I've been pretty public about the fact that I had a faith crisis at one point.
When you saw me as a missionary, you're like, how did that guy get out here?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. Luckily, he repented about 3 months before the end, but got and became the best missionary I ever saw. No, that's what his life's going to be like. He's going to repent at 75.
That last 3 months, I'm going to be receiving revelations myself.
Tim is the
exalted.
guy. Tim is the guy that works for the last hour of the day and gets the full day's wages. And me and Josh are like, what's going on here?
How do you get the same wage? Yeah.
But yeah, no, I've noticed in my own life, and really in hearing people talk about other people who are struggling, there's this tendency to be like, well, obviously there's something wrong going on in their life, or they're not doing it right. And I just don't think that that's true. I think that there's some of these things that are very nuanced and very concerning. And isn't
that so unfair that we project it right to like their lifestyle, that it's just, they must be sinning?
Well, I want to just say, this is something that I've come to that's helped me with that very issue. And I just want to say that for people, if there's anybody listening here who is suffering some sort of faith crisis or struggling with some things and are feeling that says more about them than it does about you. Yeah. Because I firmly believe, again, it's an insecurity. It's a situation where, well, if it's not working for them, like, they can't handle anything outside the box. So in the box, they think if you do all the right things, you're going to believe it. Right. Like, I remember saying that on my mission a bunch of times. If you actually did what we asked you to do 100% of the time, you will come to the knowledge that it's true. And the thing is that's not necessarily accurate. Okay. Yeah. And so there's a lot of things that go into that. Some of them environmental, some of them, familial, some of it culture, some of it DNA. I mean, there's so many things that affect it. Right. And but my point is that if the person can't handle anything outside the box, because then if they accept that you're doing all the right things and you're struggling with it, they might need to struggle with it too. Right. And so there is a concern for them, it's a concern of their faith. Because if you're considering leaving when doing all the right things, then they are not safe.
Well, there's and this challenge has always existed if you read the Bible throughout the church of this fake facade. You know, he talks about the Pharisees and the Sadducees who outward appearances, but inwardly they're sepulchers, right? Whited sepulchers. Um, and I think that I really enjoy this personal revelation. I really enjoy the church and the phase it's going through in growth right now because we are becoming less of a Utah church. The culture is breaking down, and in a lot of ways, it's becoming more real. And we're realizing that everyone has faith crises to one extent or another. Just some people are hiding it better, and some and
I
not,
just
not in a
I
good
just
way.
challenge the word Christ. I mean, challenges, questions, all that stuff is fine. But what I was saying, it's not like I've never had a faith. I don't know if I've ever had a faith crisis. And you both know some of very personal things of what I've had to go through in my life from my own mistakes. But I've never had I don't know. It's a weird word when we say crisis. Just like when we say racist. I think there's a lot of different layers and levels.
There's a different level of faith crisis. A faith
Yeah.
crisis is one where your faith is really strongly challenged. But I think that
Now, when you say faith, does that mean your testimony, like your challenge, like is this true, or does it mean like my actual faith, the act of the power of faith that I have in my life, my faithfulness is being challenged? I've had a lot of issues with faithfulness. I've never had a lot of challenges with is this true? That's a good discussion.
I think it's more considering whether it's true. Because we all go through a situation.
I don't know. I would argue that doesn't matter if you believe it and don't do it. To me, it's like faithfulness is all about what you do. It's not about what you think or what you say. It's what you do.
But accountability measures up differently. I'm more accountable if I don't do it. If I know it. If I don't know it and I'm not doing it, I'll have a little more leniency. I think.
Well, I think
but I'm not in that boat.
I think regardless, I think the point is that the faith, the idea of faith crisis or struggles with faith, that they vary in degree, and some people have,
and reasons.
But I've said, and I've kind of walked this back a little bit, but if you've never questioned anything that's going on in the church, like you're just not being intellectually honest. You know what I mean? Like there's just too much stuff that raise an eyebrow. I'm not saying that you've lost faith or stopped going to church for a time or turned in your recommend or whatever. I'm just saying that, some of this stuff doesn't sit well in the logical brain, and it takes a level of, all of this faith. And I want to make this very clear. And I've just recently had this conversation. I actually had this conversation with Stephen Kyoto on my podcast, the guy from Killer Clowns, of all people. But I go, listen, all faith, it requires a suspension of your logical brain. The idea that Jesus rose again on the third day, and now by some miracle of the atonement, you can be forgiven of any sin that you've ever had, that requires a level of suspending logical belief and move into faith. And that is the way it is with everything.
I have to sort of dissent a little bit on that. I think that there's a third aspect to this, which is spiritual, and which cannot be easily encapsulated in logic versus animal brain, and that spiritual aspect of it can only be understood spiritually. So it's I think our language begins to break down. I think the way we look at the world starts to begin to break down, and you can really only have those conversations with people who have experienced that spiritual aspect of life.
Well, I think that's what I'm saying, right? Is that you have to, at some point, it doesn't make sense in your logical brain, but because you've had that spiritual experience, it's a different experience. I had another, I feel like I'm just always plugging all my podcast episodes, but I had an episode with
You're the guest, Josh.
I had a woman come on anonymously who left the church and became polyamorous, and we had a discussion of what a polyamorous lifestyle is like, and how she believed that, because it is actually, we've all heard reports of soft swinging in Utah and things of that nature, where for some reason there seems to be an element of people who leave the church start engaging in these kind of you know, kind of, I wouldn't say antisocial, but just kind of not, they're not even acceptable societally, even if you're not Mormon, right? They go into things like swinging and polyamorous and stuff. But anyway, the point was I asked her on that podcast, I said, have you been able to mimic the spiritual experiences that you had, say, in the temple anywhere else? And she couldn't find it, right? She couldn't put a name on it. And she tried to kind of wiggle around a little
That's
bit.
fascinating.
Yeah, she kind of tried to say a thing like, well, you know, I feel grounded when I'm close to the ocean. I go, yeah, I get that. Right? Like, we've all had that experience where we've been somewhere and had some sort of a kind of a good feeling. But I'm talking about a true spiritual experience where, you know, you're in the temple and you get a revelation, because I have not been able to find that in any other medium, right? And she couldn't either. And I said,
and I just have a real pet peeve, and this is a separate topic for another day, perhaps, but like I have a pet peeve with people saying, well, faith is the opposite of logic. I think they both can exist. Like, in my logical brain, religion is very logical. Like, and I don't just, like, you know, give up all my logic and stuff in order to believe. I don't feel, to any extent, to be honest. But I still believe that Joseph Smith, a 14-year-old boy, that God and Jesus Christ appeared to him. And so I just have a little bit of issue with that.
Well, I think to the extent that you logically understand that there's a level of stuff in the cosmos and the universe, whatever you want to call it, that you don't understand, right? Like there's
fully understand.
Right. I mean, like, look, I mean, I feel like I'm just plugging all my podcast episodes, but I had a guy on who did near death. He's an expert and funds through his nonprofit afterlife science, near death experiences, mediums, things of that nature. And he talked about that. He said, you know, there are things that your consciousness can do, and they've been able to mimic some of those things using MDMA and DMT and different psychedelics, a portion of that. And there's
ectometers and Ghostbusters.
So, yeah, sure. So the point is that there seems to be a level of consciousness that is not attached to the physical brain that you can access, that puts your, you know, there's a level that we don't understand. Right. And whether you want to you call that consciousness, the universe, if you want to call it the spirit, it's there. And I don't think it's illogical to think that there's possibly something that we don't understand.
Right. For sure.
So, but back to this, you know, we've been going 2 hours, and I don't think I've actually talked the chronology that we plan on talking about. But like, I'll just briefly say it. So as we said earlier, the church did not have any doctrine on this. It was not official doctrine until 1949, when the First Presidency started writing letters in response to these types of questions, citing the curse and the pre-existence. That was in 1949. And then in, I believe it was 1968 or 69, there was a second, 1969, there was a second writing from the First Presidency that affirmed the ban, but kind of walked back the reasons why and said, we don't really understand the reasons why, but for some reason God has withheld the priesthood. And then there was the 1978 lifting of the ban, but then the next official kind of declaration on this was 2013, and that was the gospel essay. So there's been 3 official kind of declarations that you could point to where, you know, the chronology is up until 1949. There was a question of whether it was doctrine or policy. It became doctrine in 49. The ban was lifted in 78, and it was officially, all of the doctrine was repudiated in 2013.
Yeah.
But as far as I would encourage, if you've actually listened, you know, for 2 hours to a podcast about another podcast. You know,
So 5 hours in total.
yeah, I would highly recommend you go and listen to the podcast, not because it's mine, although I do appreciate you listening to my stuff. It's because he was so good at articulating, like, you know, it really was me just, it was really, that was an easy interview. I stressed about it for a while, and it was so easy because I just asked a question and he just ran with it, and I just was listening in awe, and just, it, you know, it was great.
You know, Josh, when you mentioned when you were talking about his book, you said you told him that it's as a lawyer, this is what, 300 or 200 something pages. I saw 232 pages. And by the way, they have it in cloth. What does that mean? It's, you can buy it in cloth. What is that, like a scroll?
I have no idea. I don't know.
Like, Lance is always teasing me that my books are like antiques. I'm like, well, that's a literal cloth book. Anyway,
For
but you said that the
$110, it better be in cloth.
yeah.
Wow.
You said that when you read through it, it's an easy, not like an easy read, but it moves. It's not like a difficult read like a lot of scholarly books. But what I was going to say about your conversation with him, what you're saying is, when he talks, he's not talking down. He's not elevated way up here where we can't follow what he's saying. He's a very level-headed, easygoing, easy listening person as he's talking about this history. Some of the stories are a little bit, it kind of jumps a little back and forth with the topic as you go.
Yeah.
But it's easy to listen to that podcast. Not because of you, because of him. I love listening to him. Like Lance said, when it was over after 2.5 hours or whatever, I was like, oh, isn't there more?
Yeah. No,
Oh,
go ahead. Sorry, Lance.
It was also very, like, again, I think a lot of people hesitate to listen to things like that because they're like, he's a scholar, not an apostle, so whatever he says is just BS or whatever, you know. It was very scholarly in a good way, in a way where he wasn't attacking the church. He was just stating history. He was stating facts, and like, you can disagree with interpretations, and you guys talked about this, right? But he just put it out there the way it is. So I find it hard to, how can you argue with that? Like, you can form your own opinion, but you can't say this was good or bad. Like, it was,
and that, I think the thing that was so fascinating is he told so many really interesting stories about the way the Quorum of the 12 interacted. It was really fascinating to kind of, he was able, and this is what, so he's such a good storyteller, in that he was able to kind of peel back the onion a little bit on how the Quorum of the 12 work.
Yeah.
And show you how, you know, kind of how the hot dog is made. You know what I mean? Or how the sausage is made, rather. Yeah. You just get to hear it for real, how it really happened. And it was fascinating. It really was. Even if you're not a member, I mean, this is going to obviously appeal to people who have some connection to the church. But even if you don't, just as a matter of history, it's really a fascinating matter. And he is coming back. He's coming by. We have a time in April where he's going to come back. He
better be. He better be coming back, Josh. Yeah, I want to hear about.
Yeah, and that was the thing. It was funny. I got him when he came on. I was going to do one podcast with him, and we were going to go through this, and we were going to go through Ezra Taft Benson and his remark on the church, particularly how the church has swung, the church membership, political affiliation swung heavy right to more ultra conservatism as he entered the apostleship, and that was the book I read first. And I was super interested in it. And then I got this other book and I started reading it. And I was like, wow, this is the topic I want to go through first. But when we met, I go, okay, so I know you were here to talk about both. We'll be here for like 10 hours if we go through both.
No,
I talked to you like a couple days before. I was like, Josh, I want to hear so much. Like, I'm so interested in both of them. I said, like, I would break it up. Like, because if you surface level all this stuff on both topics, so many people like me are gonna be like going crazy, pulling their hair. Like, I want to go into that, go into that.
Yeah. And so that was the thing, right? Was I said to him, I would, I'm guessing if you're a professor, you're pretty long-winded, and I know I can be long-winded. So let's do this. I said, let's get through this and see how long it takes. And then we may end, and then come back.
And when you finish this story of the blacks and priesthood, I look at my app. I'm like, he has another hour. And you guys expand. I'm like, and I'm hooked on everything you talk about.
Yeah, and we really did. And that was the other thing that was cool, was he was able to also relate it to very relatable church issues currently, the LGBT issues particularly being one of them. That is kind of, I think, I really think is the controversial topic of our time.
Or Elder Oaks, I can remember. Talk about how this transgender status and issue in society and all these changes and the LGBTQ policies and stuff. And you said or Brother Harris said he feels like that's one of the concerns about the brethren is with this blacks in the priesthood. If we backpedal on that and start saying we were wrong about that and start nitpicking and scrutinizing who said what and when, it could turn around that we might be wrong about the LGBTQ stuff. And they don't want to open into that. So I'm asking you guys as a takeaway from this conversation, what we learned from these concepts, which are fascinating in great detail about the history of the blacks in the priesthood. How can we remain strong going forward as the church makes decisions, changes those decisions, or sticks with those decisions, whatever that Brother Harris said? They might not be the things that they'll be addressed. He said, if the prophets are getting feedback for that these are the issues on the low level ranks of the regular ranks of the church, they will be addressed. They just may not get the results that we want. So, I mean, what do you guys think about that? How can someone, without being like, oh, the prophets are just all wrong and racist or biased, whatever, go ahead. Like, how do we go forward?
At the end of the day, the Bible and Jesus Christ and the Book of Mormon has testified of the same thing. At the end of the day, the only two important commandments are love the Lord thy God and love thy neighbor as thyself.
Okay.
And if you keep those two commandments and receive the personal revelation that you need, then you're going to make it. Mm-hmm. All these other things are important, but they're not as important as those two things.
Yeah.
So to me, it's as simple as that. Like at the end of the day, like you can find some little hobby horse, some little excuse, some reason to leave the church, some reason to hate your neighbor, some reason to hate God. But, you're not going to have an excuse at the end of the day if you don't love the people around you.
Yeah, especially about forgiveness, because you'll be weighed with that same, there's parables about that, with the same judgment that you dish out. Josh, what were you going to say? What do you think? You've had a lot. Hang on, I just want to say you've had a lot of interactions with people. We don't need to go into those specifics, but you've had a lot of people with different takeaways from your podcast.
Yeah.
What has been the tone of how do you feel? If you could share with someone here, or just share with me, even what is it? What is it? The strength? What is going to protect us the most? What do you say to those people? I'm just saying, the people that had challenges come out of learning what they learned from it. Because I found the details, faith increasing. My testimony was strengthened, seeing the struggles and the issues and the deliberations and the compromises that happened. It strengthened my witness for this idea. I've never thought about this before. I learned about it. This institutional revelation. My testimony grew. Some people that you heard, probably it did not.
Yeah. Well, I didn't get a lot of people who it really shook them. A couple who were like, that was much different. More, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is that the church hasn't done a very good job of telling this story, in that, the church has kind of given a narrative of, Spencer W. Kimball just all of a sudden got a revelation, and then everybody just kind of agreed unanimously, and then it changed in a moment. And that's just not how it worked. That's just not how it happened. And so,
but it's important, Josh, to point out again, emphasize that is fact. That is not interpretation. And
right.
That's what he pointed out. That's fact.
Right. Yeah.
That's not how it happened.
And so that's just not how it happened. And so I think there's a few things that we can learn from this. And that is that, one, the church is not perfect. The gospel is perfect. The church is still working it out because it's been imperfect people. But in some ways, I think that should give you hope. And what I mean by that is that if a prophet can make a bad decision and affect 100 years of people, and still the atonement applies to him. It applies to you too, and you're not that far off. You know, we all get really bogged down on ourselves, me included, on what we're maybe not following the right way, or the way we react to certain things. The purpose of my podcast is to show that everybody you meet is having a very real human experience. And that includes the prophets, and they are just as human as you, even though they may have a higher revelation. And the other thing, I think that would save people, I guess, or something, is just the hardest thing in the church is to follow when you don't agree. And there's a lot of people out there who want other people to follow when other people don't agree. But if like you've said, like there may become changes down the pipe. Like I said, like what if tomorrow the Russell M. Nelson said we've received a revelation that gay people can now get married in the temple?
Yeah.
A lot of people would have a real hard time with that. But I just want those people to remember that you are asking right now, we are asking gay members of the church to live a celibate life, to never have a relationship with another human being, to never have children, to never have a first kiss. And you're expecting them to do that, even though that's not what they want to do. So so I'm just saying that in a way that, you know, so we have people who left the church because the church encouraged you to get a COVID vaccine. Okay. You know what I mean? And we're asking gay members of the church to live like nuns. So if these things happen, you have to be flexible, because things are going to change. And when they do, be flexible enough to say, okay, or at least be flexible enough to say, I don't agree with that, but I'm going to stay. Because I tell my friends, you asked me this and I didn't get a chance to say it. You ask me, what do I tell people, like when they're struggling with something? And I ask them specifically, I go, okay, so what is it that your issue is, right? Is it doctrinal? Is it cultural? Is it policy? What is it? Most of the time, not always, it has to do in some form with culture. And it has to do with the way members treat them, or feeling like they don't fit in, or maybe someone's gossiping. Lord knows that is a huge problem in the church. There are people who just gossip and talk trash about each other. It really drives me insane. It really does. Yeah. But I always tell people those things, hey, if you got a problem with the way the church works, you got a problem with the culture, please stay. Because if you leave, it just becomes an echo chamber of all those people you don't like. And so
again, that, like President Uchtdorf said, that diversity and that unique perspective, that's the strength of the church. That's a strong thing to say, the strength of the church.
Yeah. And here's another thing I'll just say to everybody. And this is a little off topic, I think, but to those people who are going to church and they're looking at all those people and they're seeing all those perfect families and their white shirts and ties and they're all smiling and loving each other and all that. I've been in enough leadership positions to tell you that every single one of those people are secretly a train wreck. So you're doing just fine. Okay. And on top of that, also remember that if you're in an elders quorum, 1 and 2 of those people are probably looked in porn in the last week. So just know you're doing okay. All right. Everybody's struggling. And that's why we go.
And I'll add on that, not to compare your life with everyone else's social media digital profile, what their life is like, what their marriage is like, what their finances are like, whatever. My only thought to add on to there, I'm just going to bring this up. This is by President Lee. This is his chapter on Revelation, which is, I love this chapter, but he says, in just at the last idea that we're talking about, following the prophets, receiving revelation of prophets, and in the scriptures, often that's referred to the mysteries of God, not just the doctrines, but like what we're asked to do. And that's how Nephi described when they would have revelations, they had challenges if they did or didn't ask God. He says, how do we develop a spiritual quality in our natures in order to serve our earthly missions more completely, kind of what Lance was saying, and thus become attuned with God's infinite power, which includes his power in revealing things institutionally to the prophets? Ammon answered that question in part, yea, he that repenteth and exercises faith and bringeth forth good works and prayeth continually without ceasing, unto such it is given to know the mysteries of God. And that's Alma 26:22. That's what Lance said, obey God, or keep the commandments, the two great commandments, love God and love others. Like Josh is saying, have patience with yourself. Don't criticize, hang in there. Stay faithful, stay disciplined, do what you can to learn and grow yourself, but be patient and be tolerant of other people. And then that includes, I would say, with a strong caution, be careful of how far we take our digging back and scrutinizing the things that former prophets have said, because they are the judges in our time. They are judges of Israel as well. That Christ, the apostles will be the judges, the disciples in America or in the Nephites will be the judges over them, and our prophets, our apostles, will be in a form judges over us. And I'm not saying so therefore just do whatever they say. I'm just saying reverently, with faith, with a respect for God and His plan. Pray and ask the mysteries. Ask why things happen. Don't follow blindly. I would say if someone's going to follow blindly, there will come something in the future that they won't be able to handle. And if all they're doing is looking down on people, kind of like what Josh was saying, if someone's having challenges and faith crisis and questions that they're looked down on, that there must be something wrong with them, or their testimony is not strong, or they're wicked, or whatever, those people that don't ask questions are the ones that aren't developing that routine, that faith, that pattern of receiving revelation in the living prophet. That's where we'll find protection.
Well, can I also put in something about the love God part? Because loving our neighbor, like I think everyone in and outside of the church, in and outside of faith, sees the value in that. There's a lot of people that don't see the value in loving God. And I would just like to emphasize that one of the major values of loving God is that it allows you to become less selfish, because you realize that there is something bigger than you. It also adds a layer of protection, because there's going to be times that you don't love yourself, and you're going to need to rely upon the fact that God, no matter what you do, there's nothing you can do that's going to make God not love you. And sometimes you're going to need to lean on that. So I just like to, it's important to have both those aspects in your life.
That's such a great point. Thank you. Guys, I want to, again, thank you genuinely. You are two of the strongest guys I know. And it's probably because you, like I said, you guys are close in my life, and that's unfortunate for me that you're who I get. But you're the ones that you're my soundboard, and as far as the gospel is concerned, and you guys educate me, you inform me, you teach me. I don't agree with a lot of some of the things that both of you, I'm not saying both of you together, but I mean I have different conversations with both of you, and we have difference of opinion. That's the beauty of this church, is that it invites open discussion. It invites opportunities to learn from each other, and it invites the spirit of truth that we can be edified together if we are faithful, exercise love for each other, like Lance says, and don't criticize, judge each other, and judge ourselves or off of each other, like Josh said. Be careful. We need to be careful and learn how to receive revelation, that we can receive that protection. A lot of our fellow brothers and sisters, this is in the Book of Mormon. The further we go on, closer to the second coming, more and more and more members of the church are going to fall away because of issues they don't understand, or their inability to follow the faith, or their own personal sins, whatever it is. It's a few in number in the last days against the whole world. And that's why I threatened you guys that I need you guys by my side in the last days, because I don't know, it's going to be a challenge for me too. I don't have flawless, perfect faith, but I want to thank you guys for your time and being on here. And Josh, again, thank you for your podcast. Thanks for doing that episode and bring that conversation, or at least inviting it into my life, bring it to light. It's powerfil. Very good.
If you leave the church, Tim, if you leave the church, don't worry. I'll still come over to your house and beat you up.
All right. You don't beat me up in church.
I said over to your house.
Yeah, I know. I'm not going anywhere because, and as Josh says, Tim, you shouldn't so blindly follow. I'm like, no, it's true.
Well, no, I don't. I want you to.
I know. I'm teasing. I know you don't feel that way.
I
And
appreciate,
you know,
I appreciate what you said, and just since I've just continually plugged my own podcast on here, he will be. I will have Matthew Harris back
Better.
in the beginning of April, and I also have another one that I haven't announced yet, but it's scheduled. I have a member of the church who's coming on who is gay, but is an active member of the church, and not only that, but is married to a woman. So we're gonna figure out how that works out.
Yeah. There was a lot of those stories coming out when that policy changed with gay marriage or the gay children gay. I remember seeing those in church magazines and newspapers and stuff.
Well, this one's interesting. I got a lot of questions. This is someone who actually contacted me, and it's really interesting. Contacted me and said, I want to come on and share my story. And I knew him, and I said, I didn't know his story, but it was funny. I asked him, he gave me some of the details, and I'm like, dude, I got a lot of questions. You need to come on. So,
Yeah, that's awesome.
So it'll be
fun. Yeah, hook cliffhanger right there. Anyway, Josh, thanks for bringing that out. Lance, thanks for watching it, because I know you're a hard audience.
And I want my podcast. In my podcast, I'm going to be playing a walkthrough of Final Fantasy 3. It's going to be awesome.
I only watch him with Final Fantasy 7, so
there we go.
All right. Okay, Lance does have his. You can watch him on Twitch. Errant Games. What is your channel?
I don't know.
All right. Anyway, you guys, thank you so much. And usually I'll put in post-production my final thoughts, but I just did, and I'll bear my testimony I already did in the beginning, but I just want to say that the church is true. Hang in there. And most importantly, just remember God loves you. And Lance, Josh, I love you guys. You're my brothers, and I appreciate your time and being here and your friendship and your faith, because you do fuel my faith as well. But the things we talked about have a lot of complexity to them. Seek out the truth yourself, anyone watching, and always rely on the Lord and keep that relationship as strong as possible. That's how you're going to survive in the last days. And I'm going to end with that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.